Slay the Princess is a 2023 visual novel about time loops and broken expectations. It's simultaneously one of the best time loop visual novels in recent memory and a great gacha game, with its big early game twist like Doki Doki Literature Club and the likes. It certainly helps that new entries in these subgenres are exceedingly rare. But this video isn't about genre. Instead, we're going to ask some questions. Questions like, why slay a princess? Why a princess? And who this openly subversive game is for? The player who anticipates the twist, or the one that remains oblivious to the end? Another thing before we start, I wouldn't suggest you watch, as in actively watch, this video. Think of it as a podcast instead, or one of those video essays where the video is just random gameplay footage. I'll let you know whenever I put something on the screen that isn't a still image. One thing I immediately knew I would love about Slay the Princess is just how much stuff it manages to go through in under 3 hours, and I knew before playing the game itself. In the trailer, the princess is arguing with the narrator about whether you, the hero, should kill her. This is your mission, but you're conflicted. Then, when she realizes that you might actually go through with it, everything changes. You can see the moment that change happens. The camera moves closer, and with a glare, the princess breaks the mirror inside it. 2, then 3, then 5 different princesses, arranged from grotesque to terrifying, continue to stare through the mirror shards. The trailer then cuts to black, but in the real game, the mirror shatters again and again. Fractions of a shard itself, a fraction of the entire mirror. Every time that shattering sound plays, the princess changes. She evolves, becoming more horrifying, tragic, and sad than before. And what's in between those permutations? What is it that breaks the mirror into smaller and smaller pieces? Death. More often than not, your death. The big twist of Slay the Princess, the first of many, many unexpected turns, is that this isn't a game about whether you want to murder a princess. It's a game about being killed 1,000 times by the princess, where who the princess is depends on how she killed you last time. Let's slow down for a minute. I'm afraid I might be going too fast. After all, you might know nothing about how Slay the Princess actually works. In which case, it's my duty to remind you that you're still in time to play the game yourself. I just described the trailer. If you really can't be bothered, here's how it works. The game starts with our unnamed protagonist already on his way to the cabin where the princess is chained. We can ask the narrator some questions, but he doesn't give clear answers. That sentence just now might have sounded confusing. Asking the narrator? Can the protagonist just talk to it? The truth is that while he calls himself the narrator, he is just a voice in your head. One of many, as it later turns out. But make no mistake, he is also the narrator. No scene moves forward without his word. He even decides which action you can choose from in each scene, and he's likely to be the cause of your very first death. So you get to the cabin. You have to decide whether to take the knife or not before heading down the basement, where the princess is. That's the first proper choice of the game, but we'll ignore it for now. You find the princess chained to the wall. You shouldn't have any problems killing her. Except, obviously, if you don't want to kill her. And not only because killing people is bad, there's that too, sure, but if fictional murder was such a deal breaker to you, you wouldn't be playing a game called Slay the Princess. You don't want to kill the princess because it's what the game tells you to do. More than just telling you, slaying the princess is the name of the game. You're set up with a weapon and an enemy with no fighting chance. You're not a warrior, you're an executioner. And that's not a lot of agency. Not a lot of choice for a visual novel with more than 20 endings. I've watched some playthroughs of Slay the Princess on YouTube, and basically everyone starts by trying to save the princess. It reminds me of the first time playing the Stanley Parable. Eventually you might follow the narrator's instruction out of curiosity if nothing else, but you'll probably start by doing just whatever. Soon you'll be stressing the limits of the simulation intentionally. Can I ignore the narrator? Sure, but can I open the door you just closed? Can I jump to my death? Slay the Princess, another subversive game about choice with an annoying narrator, has its own version of messing with the voice in your head. This one is, can I save the princess? But unlike the one in the Stanley Parable, this annoying narrator is much more resolute. You can't ignore your role in the story. You'll go get a knife to cut the princess free from her restraints and end up attacking her instead. If you don't, the weapon will magically fall from the sky and into your hands. You'll find your arm raised above her, only able to warn her before the narrator describes your swing. And if you fail, that is, if you manage to fail, the princess will take the knife from your frozen body and kill you, clumsily or more clinically depending on your previous choices. What I just described was part 1 of ending 1 of an average Slay the Princess playthrough. Part 2 of ending 1 starts as the hero climbs up the hill leading to the cabin where the princess is chained. This is where the time loop starts. This is just part 1 of the entire time loop, of course, but let's ignore that for now. This time, this second time, there's someone new. He calls himself the Smitten. He's not actually there, at least not physically. He's just a voice in your head, though I guess that makes him as real as any other character except you and the princess. The Smitten remembers what happened last time, same as you and the princess. Meanwhile, the narrator doesn't remember. He refuses to believe the time loop is even real at all. But that's only a question of time. The more you die, the more voices there are, and the emptier the world becomes. Eventually, the narrator starts speaking openly. He knew about the time loop, or rather the possibility of a loop, but he doesn't remember them. Only when the world is broken beyond repair does he accept how horribly wrong your mission went. Every time you die, the world dies with you, and you get a new voice in your head. When a world dies, a new and worse and emptier version of that world is born. This will keep happening until you kill the princess, more or less. For now, let's say that defeating the princess saves the world and sends you two up for transcendence? That could be a name for it. You know what? I'm just going to show you what happens. You might want to look at the screen now. Your fight with the princess, whoever she is this time around, will eventually reach its end. Then you'll both find yourself in the long quiet. Except she's not that princess anymore, or any other princess. The entity you fought not too long ago is being consumed to become part of a larger being, one that was just born, just like you. The you that is here now isn't the old you either. There's no track of the hero, or the smitten, or any of the other voices you might have found on your way here. You're just the protagonist now, an empty shell that can become whatever it needs, depending on who he's facing. This is the real objective of Slay the Princess. Find enough variations to fill those shells, yours and the princess. Fill in the blanks and become complete. Discover who you two really are. Since we're talking about identity, let's take a step back. Why Slay the Princess? As in, why the princess? Slay the Princess didn't have to pair the unnamed hero with a defenseless damsel chained in a cellar, but choosing this as the stereotype to fill with unique personalities, mostly violent personalities as it turns out, carries so many implications. It's a way to move against the common female lead with the depth of a movie prop, filling her with many different characters instead. It's a subversion of the damsel in distress, a reading so obvious I feel silly pointing it out. But it's something else too, and it all shakes down in the end. But there is no going back from the end. Before we get there, I want to talk about some of my favorite princesses. Until now, I've only described this game in the broad strokes of the narrative, but Slay the Princess is made of moments. I want to spend some time on those moments. I'll be showing some videos too. Nightmare and Moment of Clarity are terrifying. There's a reason why her first form is called Nightmare. And I love that this is what you get if you try to lock the princess in the basement. Nightmare isn't a ghost out for revenge. She appears after you cover in fear of what she might do when you're not looking. The animations in this story are some of the best in the entire game too, especially the section about cycles of birth, death and decay. This is a reference to the world-ruining time loop central to the game's story, but only here does its existential horror element really work. Nightmare experienced it all. This is what made her into Moment of Clarity. Experiencing what she saw from the perspective of an immortal being that doesn't skip through the worst phases of this dying world like you do, makes every following story that much more harrowing. Of Razor and Mutually Assured Destruction, I especially loved the writing. It's one of the few stories where the typical visual novel banter stops, and the narration really takes a front seat. The pacing is exceptional, so much that I'm glad there aren't many choices. Visual novels are often criticized for not having enough interaction, especially by people that don't play them, that sometimes I forget how much I can love a giant wall of text. Mutually Assured Destruction is what happens if you just go for the kill as soon as you can, every time. You and the princess kill each other, but it doesn't take her long to become better than you. By your second fight, her arms have turned into swords. Eventually, her whole body begins to change. It doesn't take long before she becomes more weapon than human. The blades sprouting from inside destroy her body just as she destroys you. She stops speaking, only living for the fight. And in the last battle, when you are both fatally wounded, you ascend. Witch and Torn. I love how the witch leads to the Torn. Together, they're my favorite part of the game. And I mean, look at her. I mean, really, look at her. It's important. It's the angry cat emoji, the greater of columns 3 emoji. She looks like a little wild cat. And if you give her your weapon, she just kills you. That's fair. That's what I tried to do last time. That's how we get Torn. The princess is stuck between some thorny vines, just as she was tied to the wall in the previous scenario. It's as if the wild of her previous form moved to the environment, but she's also stuck emotionally. She's torn because you just let yourself be killed. She doesn't know how to react. That's your chance to start again. Give her the knife until she chooses to give it back. Finish cutting her off from the vines, and then leave together and leave the weapon behind. After each of those scenes, at the end of every route, is Transcendence. And after transcending 5 times, the princess' memories are complete. The experiences accumulated through those stories bring her back to what she once was, and the same happens to you. Not the hero, mind you. That was just a character, just like any of the other princesses. Characters don't matter much past this point. She is the shifting mound, and you are the long quiet. She is change, and you are life, a stagnant life, when deprived of change. Infinite, unchanging bliss. Before the start of the game, the Echo, who is also the narrator and many other things, split your previous combined form into 2, the you of life and the her of change. He thought the death of the princess would mean the victory of eternal stasis over change, because change is death and decay, all the terrible, terrifying things that the princess becomes. None of those would exist without change. But the Echo is lying. What he says is factually true. Nothing bad would happen in total stasis, but he conveniently leaves out everything else. When pressed, he admits that nothing, absolutely nothing, can happen without change. The bad, the good, and everything in between disappears, forever. Without change, this whole game wouldn't have happened. And you like this game, don't you? So, why is the princess a princess? The defenseless being of change of the beginning is the best version of the character, as far as the player is concerned. She only gets more aggressive later on, continuing to kill the player, utterly dominating them. At the same time, she's the only version of this character created by the being who's trying to kill her. This is why it's so important that the princess is a princess. The princess is a fragile, defenseless archetype. She's easy enough to slay or save, whichever strokes the player's ego the best. With every transformation, she moves further away from the player and further away from the princess. Depriving her of change would bind her to the player's desire. It would mean keeping the princess in her initial state, vulnerable, collaborative, even sweet. That's why her changes must come not only as a surprise, but as an attack. By changing, the princess embraces her true nature. This runs contrary to the nature of the hero. The hero and the princess can't have their happily ever after, unchanging bliss of an ending if the princess keeps turning into different monsters for the hero to slay. But the princess' nature is also an assault against the player, or at least some version of the player. Way back at the start of this review, I said that most players don't want their games to become completely different from what they expected. To be fair, Slay the Princess doesn't sell itself as something it is not. It's marketed as a horror visual novel. It makes its meta elements evident by showing the narrator interacting with the protagonist. The trailer even shows a bunch of monstrous princesses. Still, the game revels in the possibility that someone might burst in with the expectation of a honest story about killing the damsel in distress. This ideal player, whose expectation end up completely broken, almost certainly doesn't exist. It's an abstraction, but the entire game is for them. Once this oblivious hypothetical player gets to the end, he's going to be so mad. Because you can't freeze the princess as the docile being you thought she was. To remove change from this world, you have to get rid of the shifting mound. And that's the princess. Turning her into that glimpse of her you think you saw in the beginning of the game, and keeping her like that forever would kill her. When the time comes, the player must choose between one of three endings. You can remove change from this world, killing the princess and basking in eternal, unchanging bliss. Boring. The game even features a joke ending about how boring that would actually be. Or you can embrace change and unite again with the princess, life appearing and disappearing erratically in an apocalypse without end or borders. The third and weirdest ending is what our oblivious player wanted, but couldn't find. Forcing the princess to stay the same turns her away from her most human, kind version. But that version of her exists, and if given the opportunity, this is what she decides to become. The protagonist didn't like being haunted by her ghost, but she didn't like turning into one either. She didn't choose violence more than you did. It's obvious once you think about it, it's literally the point of the game, but easy enough to forget when violence finds you both. But what happens if you both go back to the cabin now? With no narrator, no endless cycle of violence, and no eternal void waiting for you both, you can just leave. Turn your back to your divinity. Leave whatever violence you might expect of a story called Slay the Princess, and leave the house on the hill, and the game, and the player to do I don't know what. We don't get to see that part of the story. But I like to imagine they're doing fine.